While we may marvel at new building projects in our cities, what's not so marvelous is when they end up falling down. Bad planning, low-quality materials, and shoddy workmanship have led to everything from bridges to skyscrapers tumbling down. Today, we're taking a look at 15 epic construction fails. Number 15. The Second Narrows Bridge. It is rare for there to be just one factor that leads to the failure of a construction project. And this was certainly the case with the Second Narrows Bridge. That's because on June 17th of 1958, a number of structural issues worked against the bridge at once to cause it to crash into the Burrard Inlet below. Now, the accident itself began with a crane being used to join two sections of the bridge malfunction, causing numerous parts of the bridge to collapse. Yet after an inspection was done, it turned out that the cause of the bridge's collapse were multifaceted, with the reasoning being that not only due to the poor quality of materials used and shoddy engineering practices of those involved, but also because of the temporary arm that was holding the fifth anchor span was too light to bear its weight. As a result, 18 workers lost their lives, and the bridge was later renamed the Iron Workers Memorial Second Narrows Crossing in 1994 in order to honor their memory. Number 14. The Cologne City Archive Collapse. When building structures in a city, construction workers have to be especially careful, as oftentimes their actions can have negative consequences on the buildings standing around them. And while they're usually pretty careful, in 2009, the building of a metro line beneath the city of Cologne, Germany, caused the entirety of the Cologne City Archives building to collapse, leading to 2 deaths and damages of more than €1 billion. Upon further inspection, it turned out that one of the underground diaphragm walls of the subway station had caused so much water, sand, and gravel to flow beneath the archive building that it eventually caused its foundations to crumble and wash away. As such, thousands of precious documents were lost, making it one of the worst cases of construction-related negligence in the city's history. Number 13. The Boston Scaffold Failure. While most construction mistakes become apparent during or after an accident, what many are not aware of is the fact that major errors can occur while a construction site is being taken down. Such was the case at Boston's Emerson College in April of 2006. That's because while workers were taking down the scaffolding that they had placed on a dormitory, they chose to disconnect the final metal tie securing a 3-ton platform to the side of the building without first attaching the scaffold to a crane. This resulted in the scaffold platform precariously dangling on a mast located 30 meters in the air, and because it had a weatherproofing tarp on it, the wind caught onto it and made it crash into the street below. This ultimately led to 3 people being crushed by the platform, making it one of the worst construction takedown attempts to date. Number 12. The Charring Cross Subway Collapse. Typically speaking, building maintenance is meant to make a structure in tip-top shape, yet at times it can do the exact opposite, and such was the case in the Charring Cross Subway collapse. Occurring on December 16th of 1905, the incident occurred thanks to a 20-meter-long steel beam collapsing onto the platform below, ultimately causing most of the iron and glass roof to collapse. This led to many of the wooden boxcars of the subway train being smashed, with a total of 6 people passing away and 27 becoming injured in the disaster. Upon inspection, it turned out that the weight of the construction materials had caused the scaffolding to collapse, therefore leading to a chain reaction that caused the entire station roof to fall. As such, had the workers been a little more careful, the disaster likely could have been avoided altogether. Number 11. The Lahormultan Railway. Generally speaking, construction projects tend to build things up, but in the case of the Lahormultan Railway, it effectively tore things down. That's because Harappa, which is the archaeological site in Punjab, Pakistan, was severely damaged in order to provide material for the railway. For context, Harappa is the site of an ancient city that existed between the years 2600 and 1900 BC, and as such is extremely valuable to archaeologists. However, when the British came and built the Lahormultan Railway, they got to work dismantling it, as they used many of the bricks from the ruins in order to make the track ballast. As a result, while Harappa is still an interesting place to visit today, the ancient city is much less intact than it was just a few hundred years ago. Number 10. Lotus Riverside. When building an apartment, location is everything. After all, not only is it important to place it where the housing demand is high, but it's also crucial to ensure that the ground level below it is sturdy. However, the planners of Block 7 in the Lotus Riverside apartment complex in Shanghai, China, obviously never got this memo. This is because while the construction faced no major problems at first, issues began to arise when the builders of the block decided to dig out a 4.5-meter deep underground parking garage for the complex. This created a large pile of dirt, Yet rather than move it to a secure location, it was brought to a landfill that was beside a nearby creek. The weight of this dirt then caused the riverbank of the creek to collapse. As a result, water began to seep into the ground beneath Block 7. This made the dirt surrounding the apartment very wet, and this should have caused the company to pause construction. Yet they continued on, and as a result, the muddy ground was not stable enough to hold the apartment block's weight in place. As a result, on June 27th of 2009, the entire building came tumbling down, trapping and killing one unfortunate worker who was left inside. Number 9. The New York crane disaster. While cranes may be pretty scary to operate, what's even more scary is when they malfunction and crash into the street below. Yet that's exactly what happened when on March 15th of 2008, a crane that measured in at about 76 meters high collapsed. Now, at the time of the accident, the construction workers were busy tying lateral beams to both the crane and the 18th floor in order to give it more structural support. Yet this time around, they did so without the use of a mobile crane, which was something they had never done before. This was compounded by the fact that the slings they used were not only made of polyester, which is a very weak material for this purpose, but also not protected against sharp edges. It was these factors that caused the crane to ultimately collapse and led to the passing of a total of 7 people. Yet what's perhaps most surprising is that William Rapetti, who was the crane rigger in charge of stabilizing the crane, was never convicted of any charges. You see, he was charged with 14 counts of manslaughter, and due to him admitting having not inspected the slings used in attaching the crane, many thought that he would surely be found guilty due to his negligence. However, this did not end up being the case, as he was eventually cleared of all charges. Number 8. The Greater Noida building collapse. While cutting corners can often cause problems in the construction of a new building, few contractors have been quite as cheap as those who built the Greater Noida apartment building in India. That's because despite being set to be a large apartment building, the decision was made to use woefully insufficient materials in order to create the structure. In particular, it was found that the ratio of cement to sand while preparing construction material was not 1:5 as is normal for a building of this size, but as much as 1:20. While the iron beams used to support the structure were not the recommended thickness of 22 to 25 millimeters, but instead just 10 to 12 millimeters. When compounded with the fact that water had accumulated in the basement of the building and had made the base much weaker, it shouldn't come as a surprise that it was only a matter of time before it came crashing down. However, with a total of at least 9 people dying in the collapse, it was easily one of the worst construction disasters that the region has ever experienced. Number 7. The Malpass Dam. When it comes to creating a dam, location is critical, as the massive amounts of water and concrete involved can cause major issues if placed in an unideal spot. And while geological surveys usually ensure that these types of mistakes are minimal, the designers of the Malpass Dam learned this the hard way, when on December 2nd of 1959, the entire structure collapsed, leading to a massive flood that took the lives of 423 people. Now, the dam, which was located on the Charring River in the French Riviera, was built back in 1954. And at that time the area was deemed suitable for its construction. However, what the builders failed to realize was that the area was located underneath a tectonic plate, and thus when they began to use explosives to aid in the construction, they severely damaged the already unstable rock. To make matters worse, they built on top of a nearly impermeable rock known as gneiss, and this was problematic because it caused the diagonally flowing water to become trapped underneath the dam, thus further adding to its instability. As such, cracks began to form years before the collapse, but due to the government neglecting to do anything about it, the dam remained standing until its disastrous end. Number 6. The Theakura hotel collapse. Building regulations and oversight are an important factor in ensuring that construction failures don't happen. Yet in many of the world's poorest countries, the regulations simply aren't enforced. A perfect example of this is the Theakura hotel collapse in Accra, Nigeria. That's because in January of 2011, a hotel that was supposed to be many stories high ultimately collapsed due to a number of shoddy construction practices. In particular, it seems that the cement used in the construction was very poor, with the mix not being evenly distributed throughout the building. This was compounded by the fact that the steel reinforcement bars were too thin, thus making them too weak to hold up the weight of the materials being used. Yet perhaps worst of all, the planners of the building had never gone to architectural school, thus leading to the building's poor design. Therefore, had regulations been properly followed, this entire disaster could have been avoided. However, because they were not, the entire building was destroyed. Number 5. The Quebec Bridge. Generally speaking, people learn from their mistakes, yet the Quebec Bridge was a clear example of how this sometimes isn't the case. This was because the Quebec Bridge is infamous for not only collapsing once, but twice due to faulty design and construction techniques. Now, preliminary work on the bridge first began in 1887, when plans were made to connect Quebec City with the town of Lévis using a structure that ran over the St. Lawrence River. Yet by 1907, it was clear that the calculations made in the planning stages were never properly checked, as the bridge was in fact too heavy to support its own weight. And while the engineering team on site could see that the bridge had some serious distortions, they were unfortunately still in the process of approving a pause in construction when disaster struck. That's because on August 29th of 1907, the entire south arm and part of the central section of the bridge collapsed, killing 75 workers and injuring 11 others. After this incident, a commission was made to investigate the accident, although all of those who were deemed guilty of causing the disaster through their faulty calculations were ultimately let off the hook. As such, construction of a new bridge under a new set of engineers began. Yet on September 11th of 1916, the hoisting devices used to lift up the central part of the bridge broke, causing the central part of the bridge to fall into the water, which led to the death of a further 13 workers. Once again, no one was charged with any sort of misconduct. Thankfully, despite the bridge having already collapsed twice, it seems like the third time was a charm. That's because in spite of further concerns, construction resumed almost immediately after the second accident. And after a lot more resources were poured into the project, the Quebec Bridge was finally completed in August of 1919. Number 4. The Willow Island Disaster. While the United States has been the home of many construction disasters, the Willow Island disaster is thought to be one of the worst of them all. Occurring on April 27th of 1978, it involved the collapse of a cooling tower under construction at the Pleasance Power Station on Willow Island, West Virginia. Now, at the time of the accident, one of its towers had reached a height of 51 meters when a cable hoisting a bucket of concrete went slack. This caused the crane that was pulling it up to fall into the tower, leading to the previous day's concrete beginning to unravel. This began a cycle where concrete began to peel off from the tower at a rapid rate, and it wasn't long until a jumble of concrete, wooden forms, and metal scaffolding fell into the hollow center of the tower. This ultimately led to the deaths of 51 construction workers that were working on the tower. An inquiry into the accident was soon held after, and it appeared that there were 3 primary causes. The first was that the crane itself had been modified without undergoing proper review, leading to it collapsing when it began to lift weight. This was compounded by the fact that in order to save time and money, workers poured concrete into the tower mold every single day, which was problematic because concrete takes more than 1 day to set. As a result, the concrete was not strong enough to resist the weight of the crane once it was hit. To top this off, there was only one access ladder on site, thus making it near impossible for the workers to escape once it was clear that there was a problem. Thus, the end result of all this negligence was that the victims' families were compensated with about $1,700 each, or about $6,700 in 2020 money, by the contracting firm, with the firm itself not having any criminal charges laid against it. Number 3. The Gleno Dam. Dams tend to be pretty expensive construction projects, as the designs and materials used to build them have to be top-notch in order to avoid disaster. Yet it seems that the builders of the Gleno Dam never got the memo, as just 40 days after its construction, the entire structure collapsed, leading to the deaths of at least 356 people from nearby villages due to the ensuing flood. Upon investigation, it was clear that the collapse of the dam could be blamed almost exclusively on the negligence of the construction workers and designers. Perhaps the most glaring error was the fact that they had used substandard cement mortar, which was made worse by the fact that it never properly set before the reservoir was filled, thus causing it to become wet and damaged. They also made the poor choice to reinforce the cement not with new materials, but with anti-grenade netting that had been left over from World War I, which was by all accounts unsuitable for the job. Yet perhaps the most disastrous error of them all was that the dam's design was completely changed halfway through construction. That's because while the Gleno Dam was originally meant to be a gravity dam, a lack of funding meant that after the gravity dam foundations were built, the plans were changed so that it instead became a multiple arch dam. This caused the 2 sections of the dam to be poorly joined together, and due to the already inferior design of the multiple arch dam, this just made the whole project a lot worse. As such, its collapse could have easily been avoided had no corners been cut. Yet due to the fact of any workers that complained about the dam's deficiencies were fired, all the warning signs were simply ignored. Number 2. The Thane building collapse. While most of the buildings on this list had full approval from the government before construction began, the Thane building collapse in Thane, India stands apart for being a completely illegal structure. That's because despite the plan for it to be a relatively large apartment building, the planners never submitted a blueprint to the government office, and as such didn't have the occupancy permit for the 100 to 150 residents living inside the building. This was especially problematic because the architect involved had actually never gone to architecture school, and thus was completely unqualified to design the structure. When this is then added to the fact that the building had followed virtually no safety protocols and had used poor quality materials, it becomes clear that the collapse, which occurred on April 4th of 2013 and resulted in the deaths of 74 people, could have easily been avoided. Yet what's interesting about this case is that it's not one of a kind in the area. That's because shoddy construction and illegal buildings are the norm in the city of Thane, thanks to the fact that there's a severe lack of housing to meet the ever-growing demand. As a result, it's estimated that there are about 500,000 illegal buildings within the Thane district, with many of these not being built to a very high standard. Therefore, the fact of the matter is that until this illegal housing problem is dealt with, we will likely see accidents that are similar to this one continue to occur. Number 1. The Hawk's Nest Tunnel. Although most of the projects on this list collapsed or malfunctioned either during or after construction, the Hawk's Nest Tunnel is an exception to this rule. After all, the tunnel, which is located near Quebec Bridge, West Virginia, was built as part of a successful hydroelectric project, and as such it is still in use today. However, what's not so successful was the choice of location for this tunnel. You see, during its construction, workers found the mineral silica, which is known to cause severe lung problems in those who breathe it in. Yet in spite of this, they were asked to mine it so it could be sold for use in steel processing. And since the year was 1930 and the U.S. was in the grips of the Great Depression, the workers, who primarily consisted of poor African-American laborers from the South, could not refuse. As such, they continuously worked 10 to 15-hour shifts where they would use drills and dynamite to mine the silica-contaminated sandstone, with these workers not being given any masks or breathing equipment to use while mining. Thus, when the work was done, many workers developed silicosis, which is a debilitating lung disease caused by the effects of silica dust in the lungs. This caused as many as 1,000 of the 3,000 workers to die as a direct result, with the totals perhaps being even higher. Thus, this project, while successful, is largely considered to be one of the largest construction disasters in American history, and ultimately led to new legislation being passed in order to ensure that such an incident would never occur again. Watch our binge-watching playlist if you'd like to watch all of our most popular top 15 videos. Grab a drink, grab a snack, and get ready to binge.